You're listening to Inspire Change, a broadcast that strives to educate, motivate, and empower men to challenge traditions of masculinity. To guide us through the intricacies and intersections of emotions, relationships, and male identity is renowned psychologist, author, and speaker Gunter. This is Inspire Change.
Before I begin the actual podcast, I would like to respectfully acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, who are the traditional custodians of the land on which I work. I would also like to pay my respects to their elders past and present. Hello everyone, welcome back to another episode of Inspire Change with your host Gunter. I want to talk about something that's particularly important in many realms of our lives, but often it's not acknowledged. And that is the impact of patriarchy on sex. Yep, you heard me right. How does patriarchy impact on sex and all things sexual in our culture? It's actually not as simple as you might think. So, as a psychologist, I believe it's important to understand how the idea of patriarchy has influenced our thoughts and experiences around sexuality. So, in this particular episode, as the front runner for a number of other episodes on men, age, dating, relationships, and all things sex, I want to take a bit of a deep dive into this. So, what's the problem? Well, with something that could be as simple as sex and sexuality, we've made it obviously in our culture a lot more complicated, in my view, than it needs to be. And so I want to start by discussing the ways with which we can work towards breaking down patriarchal norms. So here goes. Numerous studies have shown that women are more likely to experience sexual harassment or assault in environments where patriarchal norms prevail. Okay, so it stands to reason. The idea is man top dog, woman underdog. Now, the most common place that's been in the media in most recent times has been how this can manifest in workplaces, educational settings. But more importantly, I think we need to think about how this may manifest in intimate relationships. We're talking about a place where women may feel silenced, unable to speak about their discomfort, or set their boundaries due to these cultural expectations imposed on them by the sort of patriarchal ideology that's prevalent in our society. Now, another significant impact of patriarchy on sex is how it's created a narrow definition of masculinity and femininity. Now, most of us have talked about that to some degree. We talk about how men are often confined to social expectations of being sexually promiscuous and aggressive, while women, on the other hand, are constrained to being sexually passive and modest. If I take it to another level, man the predator, woman the prey. Now, many of you might argue that this is a bit, overstated. I'm making an emotional or a very emotive issue out of something that's pretty straightforward and biologically and genetically determined. Now, I'm currently working with my very dear friend Dr. Mark Williams on a book about how patriarchy, which is in our vernacular, the great man con, has led many of us astray, especially in areas where we claim to have biological or genetic evidence, but for which there actually isn't any to be had. So, as I said, in this particular context, we see the issue between men as being studs and women as sluts as a particular issue. And I get this a lot amongst teenage boys and teenagers in general. Boys, herald their sexual prowess, while girls, although it is changing to some degree, are sort of still very careful about what's deemed to be promiscuous and not. So for men, if you don't live up to the hype, then you may be considered unmanly, not masculine enough. Okay, so this is really very, very detrimental to men, as well as, then leading to feelings of shame or stigma if you don't conform. Right? Particular issue. Am I manly enough? And our society certainly hasn't helped with the whole idea of the alpha, beta, sigma male categorization, which is an utter total nonsense in my book. So let me take it a step further. I want you to consider this scenario. A man who's not interested in casual sex subsequently may face judgment from his peers, his mates, who might question his masculinity. He's a bit of a wuss, isn't he? Similarly, a woman who openly embraces and enjoys her sexuality may be labelled as promiscuous, immoral, a slut. And believe me, other women are often very quick to judge, just as men are. These gender expectations limit individual expression and perpetuate, ultimately, a culture of more shame and more stigma around sexuality. So how might that shame and stigma emerge? Well, the obvious one, in fact, is anxiety. I deal with lots of people who, as a result of these experiences, have developed anxiety disorders, for want of a better word. They're actually in psychological distress. They actually shouldn't be labelled as a disorder because, in my view, in some respects, they're acting normally within an abnormal context. So let's take it one more step. Let's now explore the impact of patriarchy on sexual diversity. Now, it's important to recognise that patriarchal norms have historically excluded LGBTQ plus individuals and fostered a culture of heteronormity. Right? This exclusion has been deeply harmful to those who don't conform to traditional gender and sexual roles. Now, the interesting thing is, even in seriously patriarchal cultures, historically, some of those actually haven't been too bad when it came to homosexuality. We can take a look at Greek society. We can take a look at even Roman society. There were some stigmas around. Obviously, I'm not a historian, so, I'm not necessarily totally, and I don't have the time to totally get into the research on this, but there wasn't necessarily the same attitude and prevailing stigmatization that emerges in the Judeo-Christian arena, and including the Islamic culture. So this, if you're growing up within those religious ideologies, those religious frameworks, that are all patriarchal, by the way, they're not an exemption here, then you've got a particular problem. In some societies, such as ISIS, anyone who is deemed homosexual is likely to lose their life. So, your sexual orientation actually becomes a life-threatening predisposition, no matter how hard you try to conform. And so we really are talking about some serious problems as a result of that. So the thing that I want to bring to the fore is that if we really want to have open discourse about patriarchy and its impact on sexuality and relationships, then we need to really bring this into focus in a much broader way and then begin to narrow it down. So the key thing that I want you to take out of this is that it's fostered a double standard for men and women, and it's also imposed really very narrow definitions of masculinity and femininity. Now, at this point, I want all of you out there to sort of let your imaginations roam. But I want you to also think about the traditional masculine and feminine roles in your relationship, right? Is there room to open this up a bit more? And in the next episode, I am going to take this up a bit more and I'm going to delve into it a bit more deeply. I think it's really important because not only does it have an impact on your sexual relationship, and for a lot of men on sexual performance. I mean, one of the things that I deal with a lot is when men get performance anxiety, the capacity to maintain an erection is impaired. And it's often got absolutely nothing to do with the mechanics, the biology of it. It's what's between your ears. And there's this wonderful statement is, the biggest sexual organ is in fact between your ears. And this area really predominantly bears that out, right? And for a lot of men, their exposure, for example, to harassment and bullying, especially when it's been aimed at their masculinity, has been enormously damaging, right? And so, in a sense, you need to really work that through. In many respects, I think at this point, talking to your mates or getting support from your mates is insufficient. I think that if you are experiencing, performance issues sexually, whether that's premature ejaculation or whether it is maintaining an erection, seek professional help with someone who's trained in this particular area. Work with them to work through this. And a large part when I work with men on this issue is it has a lot to do with their level of self-esteem, their level of self-worth, their level of self-confidence. And so you can imagine if you've been harassed and bullied about your masculinity, and then it comes to trying to be the stud, whatever that means in your head, and you're not actually measuring up to scratch, which is usually some ambiguous benchmark, things get a little difficult and disappointing for you. Now, luckily, a lot of the guys that I've worked with who've had that experience actually found that their partner was in fact very understanding and very caring and were happy to work with them. And again, for a lot of guys who are experiencing this, one of the things you're going to maybe think is that if it doesn't work, I'm going to get the flick. I'm going to be rejected and abandoned because I'm not the studly, masculine, hypersexual male that I'm supposed to be. So this is where the rubber really hits the road. I mean, we've got all the social, the professional issues and so on, but when it comes to for us as men to really feel confident and comfortable in ourselves, to be able to enjoy sex outside the bounds of these, sort of unrealistic, as it is displayed in pornography, behaviors, we need to work through that. We need to go and scrap that patriarchal bullshit, and we need to fundamentally go, and take a break from porn. It's not helping, guys, okay? This is the thing. Most pornography is made for men, by men, and perpetuate the patriarchal stereotypes attached to sex and sexuality. Why is it not possible for a male to take a more passive role, if he wants to in the relationship with his partner, and she can, be the more dominant one? Let's open up the gate. Let's play around with these ideas. Interestingly enough, in couples where that's been the case, there's often been an increase in sexual satisfaction, but also a deepening in their intimacy, in their intimate, emotionally intimate relationship. So again, we need to focus on dismantling these harmful, systems that are based on patriarchy that really create a very damaged way of relating to each other. We need to begin to open up the definition of masculinity and femininity. And we need to broaden our understanding of sexual diversity. And so, as we strive for a more equitable and inclusive society, it's crucial to recognise and challenge the impact that patriarchy had on our cultural norms surrounding sexuality. It is absolutely imperative that if we want to get to be physically and psychologically and socially healthier, these systems have got to go. Patriarchy's got to go. We need to foster a sexual landscape that is based on consent, equality, and acceptance. We can, if we want to, create a world where all individuals have the freedom to explore and express their sexuality authentically and without fear of judgment. So that brings me to the end of today's thought-provoking episode. At least I hope it's thought-provoking, of Inspired Change with me. Remember, we've explored the profound impact of patriarchy on sex, shedding light on some of the double standards, the rigid gender expectations and limitations that it imposes. Remember, it's through challenging and dismantling patriarchal norms that we can ultimately pave the way for an equitable and accepting sexual culture, and one where dominance and control and coercive control and shaming and stigmatization don't really need to exist anymore. So join me the next time as we continue our journey of inspiration and change into the realms of patriarchal versus non-patriarchal sexual relationships. Until then, I want to challenge you to keep questioning. I want to challenge you to keep learning. And I want you to keep challenging the status quo, because it ain't ever served us all that well. This is me signing off. Stay curious and keep striving for a world of positive transformation. Until next time.
Thank you for listening to Inspire Change, a broadcast that strives to educate, motivate, and empower men to challenge traditions of masculinity. For more information on the Making Good Men Great movement, or for individual or group coaching sessions with Gunter, visit makinggoodmengreat.com. For inquiries regarding broadcast topics or appearing on the show, email Miranda at noirtainment.com. That's Miranda at noirtainment.com.